Most recent coming out of the London Astrology Lodge. Anyone else with? Well, anyway, my biggest problem with it is that the one speaker they advertised was the one really I wanted to hear what he had to say on fingerprints. There was another one on fingerprints too, but I didn't find him quite as, he was very full of himself. And I had a feeling that one guy was completely off base. He spent all the time just talking about him rather than actually giving a lecture. And then in the last 5 minutes, he blurts out something. And the guy I really wanted to see didn't show up. And I was kind of thinking they ought to give some money back because the very guy, I mean, I paid 150 euros for this. And I have to say that I did learn some of the ways that astrologers want to look at the hand. For example, the line of heart, which is the line right under the fingers. This one woman gave a very convincing speech about that we should call it the water line. And I thought that was very interesting. And so there were some people that were very helpful. The most interesting thing was at the end, they had people call in and who had set their charts and their handprints in early. And Frank Clifford and these people all demonstrated how they would read the palms. And that was very interesting to me in terms of how that would work. And the whole time was it was informative. You know, it was one of those things like it was a bumpy road. Like when the road was smooth, it was a super highway, and then when it was bumpy, you were out in the woods and didn't know what the heck was going on. But on the other hand, it was ultimately a good experience, except for these two guys that, well, if you're not there, you're really not helping. And if the other guy, I don't know how they even chose him because he talked for nearly 90 minutes and and Frank Clifford would say, we'd like you to get on with the palm. We'd like you to get on with the palm. And he'd just say, just a minute, I got one more thing to say. So anyway, that was my experience there at the London School of Astrology offering a palmistry thing. Oh, there was really a standout. I have to say the biggest standout, let me show you this book. If any of you want to get a book on, it's called The Art and Science of Handreading by Ellen Goldberg. And I'll hold it up here because this is one book that is really, really good. And it's completely good. It'll tell you all you want to know about. She does a better job on the mounts, if you're familiar with palmistry enough to know what the mounts might mean. And so I highly recommend her book. And she gave a great performance, by the way. She was, in fact, now that I think about it, she was practically worth it because she wasn't full of herself and thought she was the ultimate authority, and yet in many ways she was. Okay, I'll give it back to you, Jim, and we can get into it.
Okay, here we go, folks. Let's see, I'm not seeing anybody in the waiting room. If you do have a question, unmute yourself and feel free to ask. Otherwise, let's see here. We're going to start. Where I go?
Hello.
Okay. Oh, share screen. There we go.
Okay. Testing.
Testing.
All right. Cool. Excellent. I need to ask a very specific question for all of you guys. When it comes to, because I'm only 23 and I've done this ever since I was 7th grade, so I started learning about things. But I've been thinking about how this new age that we are in the age of Aquarius, how it's going to affect our lives more specifically, and how society is going to change. What do you guys think? It's just an open discussion in terms of this generation and how, generation Neptune, Aquarius, Pisces, and Aries would be more towards.
Well, I think you ought to come next time. We're all going to be talking about the future of 22, and some of the people are going to be talking about how that 22 is going to be as important as 20 in terms of the potential of what's going to happen in the future.
Because you know how the phrase history tends to repeat itself happens? It seems like since we're going into well, so since the next generation is going into Pisces and Aries right now, you know, I understand the expression of Aries is more robust, very strong in the society and all that stuff. You know, there will be conflicts and all that. So I just wanted to ask, you know, and this whole I don't want to go into another discussion about the Nostradamus theory of the prophecies and all that stuff, but it kind of correlates itself in some way, in my opinion, on that stuff. So it was just like, you know,
Well, I would suggest that you look at the fact that Pluto takes a 250-year cycle, and the fact what we're doing is repeating history in the sense of our country being polarized during the revolution. So it took quite a while to get into the Aquarian age. We haven't gotten there yet. And it'll take probably a generation before we understand fully the changes that are coming, but certainly we can think about that. Okay, so I always think of history as going in spirals. So
correct,
it
yes,
repeats itself, but in a different way for a different purpose.
for a different way. Thank you. That's a really good insight.
Yeah, personally, I don't know that we're in the age of Aquarius yet. I don't want
No,
to talk
no,
about
not
it as
yet.
if
Hey, we are?
that
Oh, because there's a lot of people that say like society, but please, I'd like to be enlightened. Like, are
Yeah.
we still in the age of Pisces or?
we're in that.
Yes.
I think we're in that transition period, and it kind of depends on how you define the age.
Okay,
What's going to mark the beginning of the age of Aquarius? Are we talking about the spring equinox at 29, 59, 59 Aquarius, or are we talking about some other, or what are we talking about? So that we'll be talking about that next month, because we're going to be looking at the USA's got 3 Pluto returns coming up next year.
okay,
And so that's going to be, the big thing for the coming year, I think.
interesting. That's going to be a
Right.
lot of transformational change.
Yeah.
Rick Levine has a big talk up on Astrology Hub, which is on YouTube, and I think their Facebook page about 2150 is that changing of the ages technically. So there's a lot of conversation about that
Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Alrighty.
versus the stelliums that we've just had, what, in the 1960s and then recently.
Also, the
Interesting.
Pluto return before the revolution was back in the 1400s when we had the Protestant Revolution against the Catholic Church. So that was a big change also. So you can see that it does have a cycle to it, and it seems like it's always a whole change in what goes on after that point. But I don't think you can pinpoint it. I think it's a gradual change.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Interesting. Okay.
Alrighty. Excuse me. So we're talking aspect patterns. Now the one main announcement is NCGRLA. They have their monthly meetup coming up next Sunday from 1 to 3. Speaker Sam Reynolds, Fundamentals of Synastry. There's a link
It's
for you.
always fun.
Excuse me. The slideshow will be uploaded excuse me, to the our Facebook page, where you can download it as a PDF. Or if you want a copy of it, I can send it to you if you're not on the Facebook page. Hot, dry, and windy here, and I don't do well in hot, dry, windy conditions. I have significant allergies with a touch of asthma.
What's the
Okay.
name of the Facebook page?
It's our Facebook page is Santa Monica Astrology Meetup.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, NCGRLA has a meetup page, and you can find out more information, sign up for his talk there. Any other announcements?
Somebody's got a radio or something. on in the
Yeah, if
background.
everybody
Yeah,
that's
somebody,
not the speaker
Okay, let's go back and
can mute their background sound, please. We're hearing the
everybody,
COVID news.
if you're not,
Thank you.
if you don't have something to say, please mute.
Thank you.
Versus, thank you. Okay. Um, calendar for significant events that are coming up between now and our next meetup. On the 17th, Venus will enter her shadow. Oh yeah, there's a Venus retrograde coming up. On the 18th, we have 6 major exact aspects. And that is Ptolemaic in nature, so I'm not counting inconjuncts or quincunxes. On the 19th, 12:57 a.m., we have a full moon, partial lunar eclipse, 27 Taurus 14, after which both the moon and sun go void of course. So you Taurians or earthy types or fixed types or people with something at 27, yeah, plan ahead, go out and look for it. Should be able to see something. Then on the 20th, the moon goes out of bounds north this time. So you'll want to be looking high, higher in the sky, above the horizon. On the 21st, Mercury goes void of course for 78 hours. And then the sun will enter Sagittarius. On November 24th, moon returns in bounds. On the 27th, which is not the, which is what the Saturday after Thanksgiving. We have the moon sun third quarter square. And then on the 28th, which is what, weeks, the sun Mercury superior conjunction at 7 Sagittarius. Superior conjunction is when Mercury is directed on the far side of the sun. Then on December 2nd, Mercury will go out of bounds south. On the 4th, the moon goes out of bounds south, so they'll join Venus. But then on the 7th, the moon and Venus both return in bounds. On December 11th, 7 exact major aspects. And on the 12th, it's our monthly Santa Monica Astrology Zoom meetup. We'll be taking a look ahead to 2022. And I think we're going to try something. When we used to meet in person at the on Urban, we would always start with what we called a talk around. And everybody would introduce themselves. It'd be like a 12-step astrology. Hi, my name is Jim, and I've got sun in Virgo, Sagittarius rising, moon in Sag, kind of thing. And it was a great way to start things off. Helped kind of break the ice. People could see, other people with the same sun rising or moon signs. And we often found that they would cluster together in the room, even though they didn't know it intentionally. We don't do it generally with our meetups because of the time involved. So, but we'll try it for that because it's going to be more of an open session.
Hey, Jim, can I just chime in real quick to remind folks to go out and watch the astronomy, because it's been a fantastic show for 2 years, especially with all these planets out of bounds, either above or below the ecliptic. It's been fascinating to just observational astronomy astrology. Wow,
Yeah.
I'm so excited about it. Can you tell?
Yeah, I mean, because the moon goes through a 9-year cycle where for 9 years it doesn't go out of bounds, and then for 9 years it goes out of bounds. And so in the course of the month, it'll go out of bounds south, which means it's low and across the horizon for us, and then out of bounds north, where it's higher. And it keeps going a little bit farther each month until it reaches its maximum, which is known as a lunar standstill, and then it starts to creep back in. If you simply orient yourself and you see Venus as the evening star and you see where she sets, she's setting more towards the west southwest than west. And then you can watch her, for a little while yet. You'll watch her as she'll be able to start coming farther, but she's going to be going. I think she stations retrograde around December 19th.
Right. She's been very low in the horizon. There's a great app called Star Chart where you can watch all of the planets rise and fall, the positions. Recently, you're going to see moon, of course, Jupiter, Saturn, and then Venus.
Yeah, the nice thing is, even with LA's bright lights, you can usually see all the most of the planets, at least the visibles, even if you can't see many of the stars. Okay, for today's agenda, we're going to explain the basic difference between aspect patterns and chart patterns, which we talked about last month. Talk a little bit about the Hubers and why they're significant when you start looking at aspect patterns. And then we'll go through some basic aspect patterns: T-squared, grand cross, grand trine, something called the Huber small talent trine. The Hubers refer to the grand trine as the large talent. We'll talk about the mystic rectangle, the kite, the yod. All of these are, and the boomerang. And these are all vary from reasonably common to not so common. Some aspect patterns are so rare that, we won't be talking about them because I couldn't find a chart for an individual.
James, I'd like to add a comment into that. So this is my first time here at the Santa Monica thing, Zoom chat. So thank you for allowing me guys to, come here and all that stuff. I do have a T-square on my chart, and my moon and my Saturn in the second house of Aries, and moon in the 8th house in Libra is in opposition, and the apex is Mercury in Capricorn. How in T-squares, how do you manage to deal with T-squares in, day-to-day use, things like that? Because it's always
that's where we're going.
Okay.
Now, for practical purposes, we're going to start with, we're just going to look at the 10 planets. Because the 10 planets, if you think about them, they're large physical bodies that have gravitational fields and exert influence on the whole solar system around us, between their struggle with the gravitational field of the sun and their own. Jupiter influences weather on Earth. So there's all that dynamic going on. Now, then we'll talk about bringing in some other points, things like the ascendant and the midheaven, possibly Chiron, the nodes, and other asteroids. But what happens is that if you have a configuration made up of just by the 10 planets, you'll find that it's a much stronger configuration, generally speaking, than a configuration that involves asteroids or smaller physical bodies, such as Chiron or possibly the nodes. Keep in mind, the nodes are always opposite, so you've always got that oppositions there. So as soon as something is squaring the nodes, you've got a T-square. But what's interesting is that we will also show how just adding the ascendant and the midheaven can bring a lot of dynamics out in the chart, and can also play a significant role in a person's life, because those are the 2 points that generally tend to connect the chart and the individual to the outer world. And we'll talk about something called if we have time, we'll talk about the Huber learning triangle. But if we don't have time, don't worry, all of this is in the slide. Okie dokie. So aspect patterns versus chart patterns. Chart patterns are the symbolic pattern made up by the 10 planets. The bowl, the splash, bundle that we talked about last month. And if you missed last month, the video recording of it is up on our YouTube channel. And if you need the link, drop me an email and I can send it to you. Aspect patterns, on the other hand, are geometric shapes that are created by 3 or more planets within the chart pattern. And you'll find that in many charts, a planet may be involved in more than one aspect pattern, or it may not be involved in any, or it may even be on aspect. As I explained, we start with the 10 basic planets, and then we go beyond that. So basically, an aspect pattern is a pattern within the chart pattern. All right, moving kind of quickly here because we want to get into the actual patterns themselves. So Bruno and Louise Huber. Bruno Huber was a Swiss astrologer and psychologist born in 1930. When he was young, he had a very voracious interest in astrology, psychology, philosophy, but became disillusioned with the practice of astrology because it wasn't really working that well for him. In 1952, he met Louise, who was an astrologer and esotericist. He discovered an immediate common bond. She reignited astrology. They married a year later and lived in Zurich. In 1968, they founded the Astrological Psychology Institute, which became an internationally known school of astrology. And they've since established additional schools in the UK and Spain. They've written several books covering the principles of their methods and teaching. And today there are several thousand graduates and practitioners of the Huber School and methods. Bruno died in 1999 and Louise just died recently, earlier this year. I will add that not all astrologers agree with their methodology. That's a nice thing about astrology. There are various schools, various approaches, and it's what works for you. Once you learn the basics, it's what works for you. That seems to be best for most people. Now, the Hubers were the ones that actually created the color coding method for aspect. The idea of using red for squares and oppositions, blues for sextiles and trines, and the green for the quincunx. All that came from the Hubers. Now, of course, the primary colors are red, blue, and yellow, and they had thought about they were going to use yellow, but fortunately, yellow doesn't always transfer well or display well, particularly on a computer screen. They went with green. And here's some of the information. They look at red or squares in opposition as being like an energy aspect, involving achievement, energy, cardinal. It's linear in nature, sun. Blues, the sextile and the trine, material aspect. Pleasure, matter, fixed, quadrangular, Saturn, and the green, which then they include the semi-sextile as a green aspect. Awareness, and call it an awareness aspect. Sensitivity, consciousness, mutable, triangular, moon. So it's some of this that I think where other astrology starts, I don't agree with all of this. Well, it's not a matter of, they use the basic color coding anyway, even if they don't agree with the principles for the ideas the Hubers espoused. All right. So this is from their book on aspect pattern astrology, and it's listed on the later slide in the references. So they look at reds being square in opposition as an expression of an inner dynamism, vitality, motor energy. Those aspects transport energy from one planet to another, giving strength even to the weaker planets, and they overcome resistance and fear. Now, in their work, they did not use the semi-square or sesqui-square, both minor aspects. Just the point. The blue, the sextile, and trine are concerned with material things. They're bearers of abilities, qualities, and talents. The trine represents a mature talent, the sextile, a talent to be developed. The blue aspects give no stimulus to do other than for pleasure. So you need a mix of the red and the red is the impetus, the stimulus to do, and the blue is the desire for something or the talent awareness of something. But if you have a talent and you don't use it, so it goes. Green, semi-sextile, and conjunctor quincunx relate to an awareness or consciousness or unconscious. Semi-sextile is the small thinking steps. Quincunx, the large thinking step, striving to the unknown or unfamiliar. Now they have something called the Huber learning triangle, which consists of a square, a quincunx, and a trine. And there's more about that later. If the sequence occurs in a counterclockwise motion, which is the direct motion of the planets around a chart, it allows for quicker learning and adapting to any necessary changes. And it goes, you read it from red to green to blue. And so if you see there's a square and in a quincunx and a trine going counterclockwise, that's a dominant triangle. If on the other hand, reading red, green, blue, you're going clockwise, then it's following the retrograde motion of planets, and it is not as powerful. It's an experience type of thing where it requires more repetition to incorporate things into the life.
Jim, could
Right.
I ask what book I could get this out of? Because we're doing Mercury and learning styles. So this might be helpful as far as astrology goes.
Yeah, the only book that the book that you get this out of is the Aspect Pattern Astrology by Bruno and Louise Huber.
What is it?
Aspect Pattern Astrology.
Okay,
Yeah, it's on the reference list at
because
the end.
I've read their other books, but I hadn't heard about this one.
Me too. I have several of their other books, but didn't have that one. Go figure. Bought it for this. Thank you, Spencer. You can put me onto it. All right, where are we at? Oops, wrong button. Here we go. Try this one. All right. Here's some consideration common to all aspects and aspect patterns. You need to look at the planets involved, and is the planet in rulership? Is it exalted in fall or detriment? How strong or well positioned is the planet? What are the aspects? Are they applying or separating aspects? Are they waxing or waning aspects? Are the planets in the same mode or in the same element? Or are they in a complementary element? Or are they in a non-complementary element? Are the planets in direct or retrograde motion? And are the planets inbounds or out of bounds? Getting some of that gets a little more obscure, but those are things to add to your toolbox as you start studying, looking at aspects and aspect patterns. A transit, including by progression, to any planet in a pattern activates all the planets in the pattern. Which in turn, if you've got for example, you've got a planet sitting at the apex of a T-square, but it's also part of a grand trine. A transit to that planet will not only activate the T-square, it will activate the grand trine as well. T-square, here we go. All right, T-squares are comprised of two planets in opposition and a third planet squaring both. Generally, the planets will be in the same mode. As such, it will be a cardinal fixed or mutable T-square. However, when planets are near 0 or 29 degrees, there may be an out of sign T-square. Transits to the empty point, that is the point opposite the apex planet, and square it to the others, will create activity and may provide an energy outlet for the T-square. So there's part of the answer to your question about your T-square. Transits to any one of those points will activate the T-square, but also a transit to position opposite the apex planet, which I think you said was Mercury, will also activate that T-square and may help to provide an outlet for the energy of the T-square. They're associated with tension and agitation, but may also impart considerable drive. They seem to be, an individual with a T-square may seem to be always on the go and be an achiever. Now, this is from a book by Karen Hamaker's Sondag. That's also on the reference list. Aspects and personality.
Oh, yeah.
From the Hubers, they call this a T-square an achievement triangle. Now, don't confuse triangles with trines. Triangle is a geometric pattern. Aspect patterns are all geometric patterns. And in one word, if it's three-sided, it's a triangle. The impetus for action may find its clearest expression in a T-square. And the apex, the planet squared by the other two, indicates where the achievement should be directed and which planetary principle to use. But from the Huber method, you're looking at that apex planet as being your indicator for where to direct your energies, your actions, and which planetary principle to focus on. Now, here's an example. Here we have Marilyn Monroe. You'll notice she's got, now, here's two things. First, the chart itself that you're seeing, the wheel is one of the Huber wheels from Solar Power. I decided to use it, one, because it's Huber, but two, because it does tend to display the aspect pattern nicely. And so what I've done is turned off all the planets that are not involved in the T-square, because we want to look at the emphasis of the T-square. Keep in mind that there's, in this case, 4 planets here, but there's 6 other planets involved that are also part of the person. So we have 2 T-squares. There's the Neptune Moon Saturn T-square and the Neptune Jupiter Saturn T-square. So Saturn is the apex on both. Spencer, you want to jump in and talk a bit about this? Spencer?
I was muted. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
oh, there you are.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Well,
Well, the thing about the T-square to me with Marilyn was it shows a lot of drive. These T-squares show a lot of drive, and the drive for her, if you notice at one level, is the Neptune, and then the Saturn. And she's had trouble with a lot of things. She actually manifested in the Neptune being a movie star. And the way I look at it, I usually use Neptune as ruling film and a kind of Uranus electronics. But that's neither here nor there. But I think you can see the amount of energy that this gives. And the thing that I noticed is that she had issues with her own father, as far as I can tell, and she had a really strong need to have this emotional energy that she had put into this thing. The conjunction between Jupiter and the Sun really gave a strong emphasis to her emotionality and her need, and the Jupiter gave her the energy to drive that emotionality and her need. And then all of this had to be proven. She really had to do it. And she worked very hard at becoming a woman of great acclaim. I mean, she changed her name, she ditched her first husband and moved very quickly. It's just, unfortunately, in the end of her life, there were a lot of problems, which also I think that she did kind of overstep some of the social ways of looking at things when she said that, did that singing happy birthday to the president and an odd, I don't know how many of you saw that, but anyway, it created a lot of problems. And in the myth of Marilyn Monroe, that kind of set up some real issues about how she died. And that once again would be that she got involved with an authority situation that worked out poorly for her. So that's it. We also should look at the Neptune rules. The Neptune is in the 8th. And so, of course, her sexuality and her evolution in sexuality was definitely part of the emphasis here. And the power of that sexuality was very, very strong. And the other thing, when you look at that, the Jupiter, which rules, where did it go? Here, I think that's the 5th house, if I'm not.
Yeah, the 5th house.
That rules the 5th house. Also, she had love affairs and situations that got become a problem, but she always got involved with some male who was kind of dominant in one way or another. And then they would have to get divorced. Either like with Joe DiMaggio, she was very, very popular, and he was a real status symbol in sports. He made a hit in 57 games in a row, which is still a record, and he received great claim to that. And she says, she asked him, according to her biography, that, have you ever had people, isn't it amazing have people yell at me like this, when she was getting noticed on the street one day? And he says, oh yes, I know all about being famous. And he soon kind of drifted away. And the same thing with Arthur Miller. And so when you really start looking at her chart, you see a lot of direction. And of course, when you then start looking at where we have the Saturn popping up, it's all involved with a real need to kind of prove herself. And that Saturn is in Scorpio. So that's another aspect that ties it in ways to the 8th house.
Also, Spencer, you remember, wasn't she brought up in a foster home because her mother had mental problems?
I think that's correct.
Yes.
Yes, and I think that was her living in that kind of poverty situation, which was probably the impetus for wanting to be something.
Oh, yes, that fourth, the IC having that Scorpio and then Saturn there looks for stability. And she found it in acting.
Spencer, I think you mentioned earlier on the father here.
Yeah,
Where did the father come in? Can you repeat that?
well, here's Cornelia brought up a very good point. Two issues here. One is that I'm suggesting that she fell in love when she had her career with men who had a lot of power and authority. And Cornelia pointed out that she was brought up in an orphanage and did get married to an older man who helped her get out of the orphanage. And
Right. But
and
where
so
is that in the chart about the father?
Saturn.
That's Saturn. Okay,
Saturn in the fourth house.
gotcha.
Keep in mind that this is chart is only showing the T-square, not the rest of the chart,
Mhm.
Right.
not the other planet.
Could we say now that the apex point points towards the 10th house of career?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to point out as we go here without the ASC, without the rising sign and the MC, that you look at some of these people's charts and there's a lot of squares and oppositions that gives them drive. You have to find relief in this chart. This issue with Saturn is not going to go away easy. And especially when it's involved with Jupiter's moon and Neptune, very big power planets in the chart. It's amazing. We'll go on and you'll see, Jim and I were both kind of astonished too, when you looked at certain charts, that some of them didn't have any soft aspects, and they were very famous.
Okay. The Grand Cross. See. So the Grand Cross is created by 4 or more planets with 2 oppositions and 4 squares. Typically, they will encompass all 4 signs of a particular mode. So you'll have a cardinal Grand Cross or a fixed Grand Cross or a mutable Grand Cross. But again, when planets are near either the very beginning of a sign or the end of a sign, you could end up with a commonly termed an out of sign Grand Cross, where
Mhm.
maybe one of the planets or 2 of them might be in something other than in a different mode. These generally seem to be a bit weaker or can even have a more challenging effect because the energy doesn't balance out. When you have commonality of energy, which in a Grand Cross, all the same mode of operation, it's going to be very dominant. At a mutable Grand Cross and a solar return one time, and it was a year during which I could do a lot, but I didn't necessarily get a lot done. And I just had to kind of accept that I couldn't force things to happen. I had to just go with the flow. Now, the Grand Cross implies inner tensions and a self-defensive attitude. May have periods of relative tranquility, but they generally won't last. Why? Because you've got 4 points or more at basically 90 degrees from each other. And when anyone is activated, the whole thing is activated, each in their own unique way. Viewers refer to this as an achievement square. Yes.
It's it. James, can I mention one thing about the T-square? Because our friend was interested in T-squares, but I have a T-square, cardinal T-square. But look at the planets when they fill in and become a Grand Cross. When there's a transit there or progression there, what happens then? Okay, like I just had my progressed sun hitting the right degree, so it created a Grand Cross. But that's the first time I've been able to say to myself, you finally figured out what this means. Gave me a sense of tranquility, like you said, okay? Like stability.
Yeah.
That I wasn't fighting myself everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
that's
that's-
important too when transits hit them, yeah.
Yes,
Or
very important.
complete them, yeah, change it into something else.
Right, and by progression, it's going to be much more significant because the movement is much slower, and so it's going to have a much longer lasting.
Yes.
I mean, if you use a 1 degree orb for the sun for progressions, that's still a 2-year thing. The Hebrews refer to this as the achievement square with high energy potential, which is stored in the oppositions, and then energy is discharged through the corners, the squares. They may have difficulty relaxing due to that high level of dynamism and energy from the pattern. So let's look at a grand cross. Henry Mancini, great composer, musician. We have Moon, Jupiter, Uranus, and Venus. So what is the mode of this grand cross? What energy signs, what are the mode of the signs involved?
Mutable.
Yeah, this is a mutable grand cross.
If I could speak in here for a minute.
Please
there's
do.
A lot more controversy about the Grand Cross, and because there are a whole group of astrologers who find it debilitating. And obviously here with Mancini, there's not much, he really became very famous and did a lot of work and had a lot of energy. And I have a friend who's very big on the Grand Crosses, and she uses as an example. I would say she's actually a fan of AOC, if you know who AOC was, who has a cardinal Grand Cross. And from the time she got into politics and upset the incumbent, she's been quite a progressive person, and she has a lot of energies. So I just like to suggest that as we go through looking at some of these energy fields with the Grand Cross, that we also consider that it may also be like the Hubers. I think we're closer to what I would consider the Grand Cross than some of the others that look at weakness.
Yes, it's not a weak. The only potential weakness to a grand cross, I think, is trying to decide which action to take or what to do, or the desire to try to make things happen when in reality it's more about allowing and taking advantage of the opportunities that may present themselves. So it depends in part about a lot on how the grand cross is placed, what signs, what is the mode of the signs, what are the elements involved. See, with a classic mutable grand cross or cardinal grand cross or fixed grand cross, you've got all 4 elements involved. But if you shift it so that you don't have all fixed or mutable or cardinal, all of a sudden that dynamic shifts with it. But this provides that impetus for making things happen. And because you've got 4 points, now keep in mind, if you've got here, for example, the moon is part of it, but every lunar return will highly activate this grand cross. And it's activated every month. All 4, all the other points, everybody's activated every month by the moon's transit alone. And even though they're
I think somebody, I think it was Marion, pointed out that a T-square is like a three-legged table, but a grand cross is like more stable because it has 4 legs.
Yes. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. The 3-legged stool or the 3-legged table or see. All right. So now we look at the Grand Trine. The Grand Trine is going to consist of 3 planets, each trine the other 2. And generally all will be in the same element. However, if the planets are near 0 or 29, there may be a mixture of elements, which would be basically like an out of sign Grand Trine. Some only consider it to be a Grand Trine when all the planets are in the same element. Personally, I don't. The aspect is there. You can't deny it. Um, yeah, so but it's your choice. You decide, as you learn and become more comfortable in terms of looking at charts and getting to know the people involved, how is it playing out for that person? Now, generally with the Grand Trine, things may tend to come easily. They may encounter fewer obstacles or challenges and may be more lucky, whatever that may be. It can form a stopping place where one can rest and recover. And the element can suggest how this can be done. Now, with Hubers, they call this the large talent triangle. It represents a special talent. It reveals an accomplished ability and varied experiences which may show aspects of the personality. Planets, elements, and signs suggest the nature of that talent. So here's where the Hubers differ significantly, I think, from mainstream astrology, because they're talking about a large talent triangle. It's easy. Things come easy. But there's an old expression called the curse of the Grand Trine, which suggests that if the individual doesn't put forth some effort, all that may be promised by the Grand Trine or may be hidden, that lays in the Grand Trine may not manifest. A person may have the natural talent as a musician, composer, artist of some way or whatever, mathematician, but if they don't use it, if they don't nurture that talent and put it forth, it's just going to sit there. It's kind of like the person who is expecting, as a Grand Trine in the one of the planets is like Jupiter in the 8th house, and the astrologer told me, hey, you're going to be coming into some money, and so instead of working towards that goal, they sit at home waiting for the publisher clearinghouse guy to knock on their door, even though they never send in a publisher's clearinghouse entry form. You got to answer the door when opportunity knocks. It's that simple. I've got a couple of examples of Grand Trine. And here's Jamie Lee Curtis. She has got a Grand Fire Trine. Oops, I gave away the answer. Oh, well. But you see, Mercury, Moon, Uranus. This, she's the actress, daughter of Hollywood idols, Tony Curtis and Janet Leigh. Famous for, she's known as the Scream Queen, famous for all the Halloween movies and many other movies. So she's had quite a career. But you can see the dynamics going on here. Mr. Grendel?
Well, I think that two things I want to say. Well, I'll say that when we kind of get to the end of this. The aspect that I really look at here is that she has the. Let me look at this again. The Uranus is in the 8th, and I think that with the Mercury gives a great amount of variability in terms of what she does. And I one of the things I always think about the 8th house, shows an evolution, the idea that as you move along, you shed skins and you get involved in other things. And she's been able to actually be involved both in film and in television, as I recall. And she has this great ability in Mercury to communicate, as Jim pointed out about the Mercury. But I think the biggest thing here is this moon in Aries, which she has a tremendous amount of drive. These moons in Aries can really generate a lot of this kind of way of wanting to achieve things and wanting to make things happen. And I think that when you think of it from that point of view, she has had this power. And the moon, as far as I can see, is involved with, does she have an interception here that I'm not seeing?
Let's see. Yeah. Cancer, Capricorn.
Because I was going to leap into the Cancer, but the way I look at the nodes, the Cancer is intercepted.
Mm-hmm.
And So that would be another other interesting thing. If she did have Cancer intercepted, that would mute some of this energy, so she would not appear to be quite so aggressive as you might think she would be with the moon in Aries. And
Yeah.
so I think that is something to really consider. And of course, then the Uranus, of course, is ruling part of the second, yeah, I guess part of the second house by a couple of micro minutes here. So I think that she's proved herself quite adaptable and able to function quite well in multiple tasks.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think there's something else that was may not be readily apparent. You've got Mercury at 21 and her ascendant at 25 Sag. So basically that Mercury point of the grand trine is also bringing in the ascendant. All right, now here's another example of a grand trine. This is Janis Joplin.
Okay, yo voy a tratar de ver esto en Zoom.
Okay, if you're,
Déjame cerrar.
please mute yourself when you're going off.
Estoy vestida ya, voy a ir con lo que tengo, okay?
Okay, hello, mute yourself, please. Please remember, please stay on mute unless you want to say something to the group. Okay, so Janis Joplin, what a talent. Now she's got 2 grand trines. Here we see the sun at 28 Capricorn. We have Uranus and Saturn at 0 and 5 degrees of Gemini and Neptune at 2 Libra. So here's the classic out of 9 grand trine. So you got 2 air points and 1 earth point. Now, when I talk about complementary and non-complementary elements, I'm talking about those that are opposite each other. Like the complementary colors on a color wheel. Earth and water are always opposite each other. Fire and air are always opposite each other. And so if you look at a chart, you'll see that the Uranus and Saturn in Gemini, which is an air sign, has an earth sign on one side and a water on the other. They're non-complementary. But directly across you have Sagittarius, which is the fire sign. And so this is where it can get a little trickier trying to figure out how this grand trine might play out, or both of them. In that you got the sun sitting in Capricorn, an earth sign. It's not complementary. This can cause a little more stress in a grand trine because of this it's kind of like a foreign element. It's kind of like the air signs are happy, except it's like they have a little grain of sand or a pebble or a big rock in their shoe. It can cause some irritation. He was certainly unorthodox. He certainly created sensation when she came on the music scene.
Jim, where's her moon?
Oh, well, that's another question for another time.
Oh,
Yeah, I didn't want to get in. I was trying to focus just on the grand trine, and I
oh, okay.
realized that
I just think that wouldn't the moon really play a part in how this all manifests?
yes, if you want to look at how everything plays out, then you have to look at the whole chart.
Oh, okay, then we won't
Okay.
go.
This is an exercise in getting people to look at the dynamic of the aspect pattern so they can see it. Hopefully it'll be easier for them to spot when they're looking at a full chart.
Got it, okay.
Because when you get to a full chart and you start bringing in other points, all of a sudden it can get pretty cluttered, as we'll see later. Now the Huber small talent trine. This is something unique to them. Got this of a trine and 2 sextiles, where you have two planets trine each other, and the third planet is at the apex being sextiled by both of the other planets. They consider it similar to a large talent trine, but it shows a developing talent rather than a developed talent. Sextiles assimilate the signs and houses that they stretch across. And this shows the area where growth can be achieved by adapting as much as possible without stress. Knowledge and skills are best developed by calmly absorbing them into the consciousness, trying to remain in a state of, rather than minimizing anxiety and stress in terms of working with this. So let's take a look at one. Now, here we go. Venus Williams, world-class famous tennis player. She has this nice little Mercury trine Uranus and both sextile Saturn, going from 2nd to 9th, and that's in the 10th house. 2nd, 2 to 10 to 2, 10, 11. Two, 10, 12. It's right on the cusp there. Okay. But you can see here we have Uranus, Mercury, and Saturn. Now, the interesting thing about the Williams sisters, Venus and Serena, is I think that Venus is the older, she's taller, but her younger sister, Serena, has by numbers a more successful career as a tennis player. So they are ranked number 1 and 2 in terms of total earning. But Serena, the younger, is number 1 and Venus is number 2. Here you have this water and earth mix, which is complementary. And so this gives it a more favorable dynamic because, earth and water are always opposite each other.
Jim, can I say something here?
Please, yep, jump in anytime, Spence.
Okay. The thing I think about this when you look at it is the the way that it's ruled by Saturn, and the whole concept of her father is part of a movie that's coming out about their life and how he was such a dominant person in training them, in getting their talents developed, and giving them the kind of solid basis and having someone believe in them. And I think that when you look at this, that the Saturn and image of the father is the focal point of this talent trine. And I think that they had to work for it. It's not like a grand trine where it's just in your lap, but they got there because of that Saturn. And then Uranus, Mercury, they kind of just stepped onto the stage and became very well known almost as they were very young, and they lasted a long time in their career area. And the other thing is that Saturn is in Virgo. And I think when you look at that aspect of it, the fact that the Mercury rules the Virgo, and in the long run, they had to kind of break away from their father, as well as be very happy that he dealt with him. They dealt with him the way he did, because he became kind of, I think, now I'm not entirely of this, but I think he's the one that was a little overbearing in the end after they became famous and still wanted to control them, and they had to break away from him when they controlled their lives. So that's my little input on the Saturn and the Mercury.
Yeah. And you'll notice that this aspect pattern incorporates all 3 modes: Mercury in cardinal water Cancer, Saturn in mutable earth Virgo, and Uranus in fixed water Scorpio. So you've got an energetic blend that is going to be with the flow. It's going to be easier to deal with only because it's got a, the trine and the sextiles are easier flowing aspects. And so it can flow from the cardinal drive to the adaptable Virgo to the fixed Uranus. You think about a tennis match, you know, they need the drive to go out there and win. They need the adaptability to be able to adapt to the style of whoever they're playing against, and the fixity of being able to focus on that, the game and the opponent, regardless of all the crowd noise and whatever's going on around.
I was going to also say that Saturn has dignity in those degrees of Virgo.
Yeah. Yeah, this is where some of the ancient techniques start to come into play. I'm not a practitioner of medieval astrology or Hellenistic astrology, but awareness of rulerships and degrees of where planets may be exalted or where they're in their term or face can be helpful. And in this case, yeah, very much so.
And they're both at the same degree, the Saturn and the Mercury. It's a very tight triangle.
Yeah, got 20, 20, and 22. So it's very tight.
Right. And I was referring to the terms. That's right, Jim.
Yeah. Okay, mystic rectangle. Excuse me. The mystic rectangle consists of 4 planets or more, making 2 trines, 2 sextiles, and 2 oppositions. The trines and sextiles serve as release points for the oppositions. The individual, oh dear, I gotta fix that. The individual may be attracted to important causes and will often put their talents to work for good use. That actually comes from Cafe Astrology website. The Hubers call this the righteousness rectangle. Elements involved are important. Are the planets in active fire and air signs or passive earth and water signs? This indicates a rich supply of talent, but charged with tension. Blue aspects show a need for harmony and good behavior. Look at somebody's chart. Who's got a mystic rectangle? Oh, look, Johnny Mathis. And for those younger folks who don't know who Johnny Mathis is, he's a very famous male singer, 50s, 60s, and on. Okay. We have the moon, trining Saturn, sextiling Uranus, trining Venus, sextiling the moon, opposing Uranus, and Venus opposing Saturn. You can see the dynamics here. You've got the two oppositions trying to balance things out. You've got trines and the sextiles giving it an easier flow. Incorporating primarily, now let's see, the oppositions are earth, water. So the points are all earth and water points, and those are complementary points. So that too gives it a better blend than if they were at or near the, the transition points of 0, 1 degree or 28, 29 degrees, where you might have a different mix of elements. Let's see how the pattern is shaped. So, Spencer?
Well, I don't really have a lot to say about this. I tend to look upon this as a lot of inner tension. I think the trines and the sextiles give the appearance on the outside that they have a lot of smoothness and energy, and that they have very capable of a lot of different things. But I think that the oppositions make an inner tension. I mean, like the thing about Johnny Mathis was he was a black singer at a time when, black people, if they were a singer, couldn't even stay in the same hotel if they were performing. And he was always under this tension of being a black entertainer. He became very, very famous. And I think that was the way I tend to look at it, because he had all of this incredible flow of energy. and was so very popular, really hugely popular. And yet he also had this whole problem about, I would say, the Saturn and the Venus, because here he is making beautiful music, which is, the Venus is trining the Uranus, and on the other hand, you've got the whole concept of his beauty, and his own art form as an artist is being challenged by this Saturn, and the desire to be achieved and to overcome prejudice. And then you have the Uranus moon opposition, which really adds to that, in that he had this whole situation with his ability to emote with his emotions was always under the pressure of the very active Uranus. And Uranus, when I see Uranus under this kind of stress, I always look to see that there's a lot of inner tension that's going on and driving this. And this inner tension, as far as I can see, the moon's in Scorpio. So there you have a situation that's very, very strong. And yet, on the other hand, you have the Uranus, which is in Taurus, which is one of the money signs of the second house. So here's a guy who had a very wonderful outside. He had all of these trines and sextiles working for him and making the mystic triangle. But on the other hand, the inside of the mystic triangle showed a lot of stress. Granted that the power of the oppositions here gave a lot of push, but it also gave a lot of tension. And I think that's how I look at it when I see a chart.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it is an interesting dynamic, because it was during that time period up until the 60s, when the civil rights movement really took hold, Black entertainers could entertain at a white hotel in a white club. They couldn't stay there. They wouldn't, as a customer, be allowed in typically. Or if they did get in, they'd be relegated to the balcony or someplace else. So it was a very interesting world that they had to live in at the time and tightrope walk through. The kite.
I'd like to say
Um,
one thing about the
yes.
mystic rectangle. My oldest son has one. What I see in him is some tension, but what I see basically is stability, because you have so many outlets that you can use for that tension. And it doesn't have to be one outlet, it can be many outlets.
Yeah,
You
if
know,
you think of the
trines
mystic
and the
rectangle,
sextiles give you so many outlets.
yeah. But if you look at it as an image, it's almost like you're looking down at the roof of a building.
It looks like the top of a pyramid.
Yeah, or it could be the top of a pyramid or the roof of a building.
Mhm.
And that, with the four sides, four corners, you've got a fairly stable structure. Most houses are four-sided. Most buildings are four-sided until modern building techniques started to change things.
Yes. Because they were more stable.
Yeah. So the kite consists of 3 trines, making a grand trine, plus 2 sextiles, creating a small talent trine with an opposition between the 2 points of the kite. So you've got a small talent trine sitting on top of one of the trines. And the apex of the small talent trine then is opposite another point of the grand trine. And that other point is like the tail of the kite, which that point then adds stability to the pattern. So Karen,
let me say something about, I call it a crossbow, because if you think about the kite, you have to pull it back to release the energy. The tail of the kite releases all the energy into the head of the kite.
Yeah, it's another good analogy for it would be like a crossbow or a bow and arrow. Yeah. Now Karen Hamaker Zondag says the point being sextiled by 2 points of the grand trine and in opposition to the tail of the kite adds tension to an otherwise relaxed grand trine. These individuals tend to be more enterprising than those with just grand trine. They tend to approach issues more sensibly and have a greater success rate. And I think in part because of what you said, Cornelia, where it's that outlet. It's like the arrow, pull it back, and you have now you have a fixed and established release point for the energy of that grand trine.
Right.
Now the Hubers say the kite joins both the small and large talent triangles together with a motive of security. Now, there may be an ambivalence for further development, relying on proven knowledge, which may need to be proven by personal experience. This individual may go from one extreme to another. So here you get a combination of an established developed talent and the developing talents. And with the developing talents, there's the need to prove to oneself that whatever this theory is or whatever you expect to happen will in fact happen. Yeah, unlike the grand trine where it's an established talent, you just know. There's a knowing involved. With the small talent triangle, there's more of a learning. There's a learning and reinforcement.
Yeah. I'd like to mention also my son's mystic triangle, because he was worked for IBM. He's a computer expert, but now he's gone into his sports and is teaching handball to college students.
All right.
So you're right. There's different abilities you can develop.
Yes. So here's an example of a kite, Ricky Martin. So now he's got the grand trine of Venus, Saturn, and Pluto. And this is a mixed energy one. He's got Venus at, no, it's an air grand trine. Venus at 1 Aquarius, Saturn at 0 Gemini, and Pluto at 2 degrees of Libra. So he's got an air grand trine. Beautiful voice, charismatic singer and entertainer. And then he's got a tight Moon Mars conjunction at 28-29 of Pisces, creating sextiles to Venus and Saturn and opposing his Pluto. So there you see the kite shape, where Pluto represents the tail, and the top of the kite being Saturn or the moon Mars, but like a bow. Okay, the opposition representing the arrow, you have it pulled back and ready to go. You release the energy, the energy goes out through the Moon Mars conjunction and releases from the Pluto point. Something to keep in mind, if you or someone you know has a grand trine in their chart, keep in mind that every month as the moon transits their chart, it will create a kite at the midpoint between each of the 3 planets, or the 3 planets creating the grand trine. So every month, there would be a Saturn. You'd have the moon at midpoint between Saturn and Pluto, creating a new kite with Venus as the apex and the transiting moon as the point of the small learning trine. And then it would move on and it'd go to the midpoint between Pluto and Venus, and you'd have another one. And this time Saturn becomes the release point of releasing the energy out through the moon. And so then, you get around and he gets his lunar return, and now it's releasing out that way again. So aspect patterns can become very dynamic, particularly when you start to watch the transit of the moon. Keep in mind, because the moon moves relatively quickly, those aspect patterns that it may create or modify are going to adjust or change quickly. So that energy may not even last.
Well, I happen to have this configuration, and
yes, you do.
I do. And it's quite, I like what Cornelia said about the crossbow because I think that's really one good way of looking at it. And another way of looking at it is that the opposition also gives a stability to the kite, which otherwise might be flopping around. If you actually fly a kite, the tail actually enables the kite to be in more difficult air and still be stabilized. Now with me, I have a situation where it's very similar to this in the sense that it has the concept of the Pluto being involved in it. And I think that the Pluto being involved in it for me is very difficult. And as I got into it, that Pluto is opposing the moon, I have found that I have kind of lived several lives in one life. I have always learned things quickly and kind of moved through things quickly. I've written 3 books that are all out of print. I wrote a movie that got produced and it's now gone to nothing. And so I have kind of stepped through this. And in terms of my own life, I was a Peace Corps volunteer, which is very unusual to be involved with. So to me, and this ruler of opposition with Pluto and the moon kind of gave me an emotionality to do different things. And I had the small talent. I have really, you're working with a small talent triangle and a major triangle. And I really, in certain ways, feel like I kind of wear things out and then go on to something else. For 40 years, I was a party entertainer, and that was somewhere where I ended up. But I also was very involved in scuba diving, and I scuba dived really all over the world. And that's one of the things why the entertainment world was very good to me, because I had certain times off and I had certain times I had to work, and I wasn't tied down by any corporate structure. So there are a lot of different aspects to this. And I like what Cornelia had to say about her son moving on from computers into teaching handball, because I think that represents one of the interests that goes on as you have this small talent triangle also needing attention and needing a lot of work. And of course, then the other thing that I have is I have a square to the Neptune that's in mine. And this is also gives me 2 things. It gives me an overactive imagination, and it always gives me a good imagination. And the problem is that I have Mercury conjunct that Neptune squaring Saturn. So I have huge issues with authority. And with my own father, God rest his soul, he died when I was 17, so I got an extra trauma through him. And so it's a very complex thing, because I really have the Mercury is in Virgo, and the Neptune is in Libra. So, and it squares the Saturn. So, you know, my father was a very dominant engineer, and he was very strict. And that's why you know, as soon as he disappeared, I became much more of a rebel than I was when he was around, because he was so, you know, convincing. So I think that, and also that's an it's that part of the Trine is it's a dual aspect, because you have the earth and the air. So I really find it, I like what Cornelia brought up, that I've been calling it Kite, but I might also call it the bow and arrow, because I think that really adds another aspect to it that I hadn't considered, because I kind of considered the fact that I had Pluto down there on the end of a thing with the moon, that I emotionally shifted around and had these interesting emotional attachments to certain things. That's why I became an astrologer, was that attachment to so many things. And I really found I kept to astrology, and here I am.
Yeah, and we're glad for it. Yeah, one of the things that as I'm looking at the chart, that I noticed is that where you have an air grand trine, the Moon Mars conjunction is in water, Pisces, and they're not complementary elements. So that can add to the tension of that opposition.
Mhm.
That's one of the things to keep in mind when you see, if you're looking at any aspect where the points are at or where they're near the beginning or end degrees of a sign. Look at the modes and elements involved to see if they are they the same mode? Are they different modes? Are they complementary elements? Because when they're not, it just adds to that extra tension level. And we will be looking at a couple of charts soon that have all the 10 points in them. So you can see there may be multiple chart or pattern aspect patterns involved. So the yod, also known as the finger of God, consists of two planets that are making a sextile to each other, and both of them are quincunx to a third. The quincunx, also known as an inconjunct, is the most commonly used non-Ptolemaic aspect today. At 150 degrees, the two signs have nothing in common, not mode, element, or energy. The other aspect pattern involving the quincunx is the focused yod or boomerang, which we will see next. Karen says, the point of the yod is like a finger pointing out one's destiny. When activated by transit or particularly progression, pronounced or radical changes in one's life may occur. So if you see a yod, that's the tip of the finger, if you would, is the point you want to watch or check for any types of for transits or meaningful progressions. The Hubers say call it a projection figure, encompasses the center or core personality of the individual. What they mean by that is that the center of the chart is within the aspect pattern. The sensitive nature of the quincunxes favors the planet that forms the apex or tip of the finger. This is also important for spiritual development. Another thing I got it. I love it when I see these things I have to fix as I'm going through the slideshow that I missed before. Oh well. Drew Barrymore. Successful actress, been acting since she was a wee one in E.T. Here she has a yod consisting of Mercury, sextile Neptune, both of which are then in conjunct or quincunx Saturn. And you'll see the circle that's in between, that's contained in the yod, that represents the center of the chart or the personality, as the Hubers would call it. So here we have air, fire, and water. Now the sextile encompasses planets that are complementary. But the quincunx to Saturn in Cancer, there's nothing in common between the two. Saturn's cardinal, the other are fixed and mutable. Saturn's water, not air or fire. And Saturn would be have a feminine nature, where the others would have a masculine nature, if you want to call it that. So, and because it doesn't bring into it, it doesn't have any earth in it. There can be or seem to be a lack of groundedness due to that. It's got 3 of the 4 elements. The one that's missing, look at what element is missing in the yod. Is something to keep in mind when you're considering how is this yod playing out. You know that ideally, in normal circumstances, the 2 planets that are sextile are going to be in complementary elements. And the tip, the one that's being quincunxed by those 2, will be in a non-complementary element. And chances are the other non-complementary element will not be involved in this configuration.
Well, she doesn't have Earth, and I'm very I don't know a lot about her career path other than I think she came from a family of the Barrymores. I think that she kind of was, like you said, she was kind of born into it. And I think that would explain kind of the Saturn is the point of this, that she had a lot of coaching and things within the concept of learning a discipline. I don't really know that much about how else she functioned. I mean, like her Mercury is in the 9th house. What does that mean? I wouldn't normally think of Mercury in the 9th as being something that would create such an incredible entertainer.
So yeah, so what's missing here are the other planets, which may help to explain why, her dynamism as an entertainer. She's done several comedies with Adam Sandler. She did the two Charlie's Angels movies. So she tends more towards comedy or rom-com in terms of her acting. But yes, she is descended from the Barrymore line of famous actors going back to stage, early films, and silence, and early
Can you
talking.
see that in her chart? That she's just from her descendants from the Barrymores? Can you see that in the chart?
Yeah.
Oh, we don't have the full chart here. That's true.
Yeah.
No, but if you think of the Saturn and Cancer, okay, it has to do with genetics.
Saturn
Yeah.
and Cancer.
Mhm.
Yeah, because they're opposite. But if you think that it's in Cancer, it's like in their DNA,
Mm, mm.
Yeah, because Saturn is in it all there.
Mhm.
And with her Mercury in Aquarius, the traditional ruler is Saturn, so it answers her Mercury rules or answers to Saturn.
Mhm.
rather.
The
And al-
Aquarius part may come in because now she is a talk show host and
Yes.
she's always been,
And
it's
if
that
you've seen-
Aquarian sign of being out there for the world and helping and being.
Yes, and if you've seen her talk show, then you may get the sense that she doesn't always seem like she's got 2 feet underground.
No, she doesn't know.
Right. She's always been a kind of quirky
Yes.
communicator.
Mhm.
And that might be revealed by the Aquarius, Mercury and
But
Aquarius.
the Neptune, Mercury also goes back to her family's history of alcohol abuse
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah.
and her
She
drug
had those
abuse.
issues as well.
Mhm. I want to ask a question, Jim. This is very important to me.
Okay.
When you have, let's say you have an inconjunct, like I have Mars, Uranus, when you get a planet that comes sextile to it, say, and so you've got a yod by either in your solar return or progressions or whatever, how does that relate to what we're talking about? We're just looking about birth charts, but
Yeah.
what if these patterns happen? Like we said,
Mhm.
filling in the T-square was
Right.
one.
Well, okay, so every month the moon is going to, if the moon isn't involved already, and every month the moon, and even if it is, every month by transit, the moon is going to make a yod with the
Mhm.
2 planets that are making the inconjunct. So,
Right.
uh,
Not only
one
on
way
one
to-
side, but the other side, right?
yeah. So what happens then is, yes, it's actually going to be a twice a month thing. Yes. So it will happen when it hits what would be the Neptune position here, but it will also happen when gets around onto the other side and is sextiling Saturn, putting Mercury at the point. So
Well,
yeah, so you've got that dynamic going on. It's the general energy of the yod will manifest during those transits and as such, depending upon the planet making the transiting aspect, it may or may not last very long. It's not going to be as strong generally as it would be as a natal yod would be,
Right.
but it's going to give that same energetic to the person during that period of time. Now, to some extent, it depends on the level of the person's awareness. If you're aware that you have a yod, then you will be better able to decipher how it's might be impacting or manifesting in your life. If you're not, it's just going to be a period where things might feel a bit, some degree of discomfort or uncomfortable, because I think of the quincunx as being a kind of like the princess and the pea type of aspect, where there's something irritating, but you can't necessarily put your finger on it.
Right.
When you get the yod out of it, now you can put your finger on it.
Right.
And now so the opportunity is to become aware of what is it about the existing quincunx that is such an irritant. I believe the phrase that the ancients used was, they called it aversion, where basically means that because Mercury and Saturn have nothing in common, they're not in the same mode or element. They don't really see each other.
Right.
And the same thing would be true if, you know, the planet were in Capricorn or Pisces, because it's right next to Mercury. They wouldn't see each other because they didn't, you know, the ancients did not have the inconjunct or the quincunx or semi-sextile aspects. They didn't really use them, but they considered that basically when a planet was in the neighboring sign, it wasn't readily seen by its neighbor. And when it was in the fifth sign around, then it also was not readily seen. They called it aversion.
Can you have a yod to the ascendant?
Yes. Yes, and we will get to that when we bring in the ascendant. So that's where start bringing in other points comes into play.
Okay. Yeah.
Jim, did you mention, I think that yod or yod is translated from Hebrew as finger of God?
I don't know if it's translated that way, but it's called that, often called the finger of God. Yes.
Question is which finger, huh?
Yeah. You know, it's the pointer finger. It's the pointy finger.
Okay.
Pointy one. Okay. The focused diode or boomerang. Similar to a kite, only narrower, with an outlet point in opposition to the apex planet or the fingertip of the diode. So a boomerang is a diode with a fourth planet making an opposition to the apex or fingertip planet of the diode. This allows the boomerang to be somewhat easier than the diode, as there is an outgoing how to utilize the energy of the apex planet. It can help one to focus, but also allows for easier manifesting of negative energy. There's also the danger of over or under emphasizing the planet opposite the apex. This is from the website Astrology Weekly, which if you're not familiar with it, is something worth checking out. Link is on the reference page. The Hubers refer to this as a striving figure, considered to be dynamic in nature with a lower tension level than the yod. The field of activity is noted by the planets in opposition, which are stimulated by the two planets sextile each other. These individuals may act as if they can do anything, but may have difficulty actually doing it. So here we go. Jane Fonda. So we see the yod, Sun, Mars, Pluto. And then you bring Jupiter in, sitting on right practically on her ascendant, opposing Pluto. Now, what's interesting to note is that the three planets creating the yod are all at 29 degrees. So you've got, 29 Sun 29 Sag, Mars 29 Aquarius, Pluto at 9 of Cancer. So here you have a fire, air, water again. No, fire, yeah, fire, air, water. Huh. And then we bring in Jupiter at 0 Aquarius. So you have actually an out of sign opposition, or out of element opposition would be more appropriate, I guess. Where Pluto is in fire and Jupiter's in, no, it's Jupiter, right? Pluto's in water and Jupiter is in air.
I'd like to talk about that
E.
that Pluto, because if you look at this being on the cusp of the Leo and of the Cancer, she had enormous problems with a successful father who was very dominant. And then also she needed nurturing and he didn't seem to provide it. And she finally made that on Golden Pond was her effort to get her father back into it. And on the other hand, I think that she went through several men of I think she was also trying to look for that combination of the water of affection, and yet also the status of a person. I mean, all her husbands had something quite. She married a billionaire. I mean, she married a guy who was very big in politics, and a person very big in film. She actually, that being at 29, I think that at one level, I mean, there's a lot of cusp aspect going on in this Boomerang. The other aspect of it is look at how well the place the Jupiter is. I mean, she developed great fame on her own. She was able to have a lot of energy in a lot of different things. She was quite an entrepreneur. She made money not only on film, but also she started this whole workout craze. I don't know if you remember the Jane Fonda workouts.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm revealing my age here, but on the other hand, it really opened up this whole idea of working out and doing aerobics and getting involved with your cardiac, working your.
She was a great activist. She was
Yes.
part
She
of,
is a great-
and still is. She's still all for these causes. I don't think you planned it this way, but this is the third one you brought up with two with famous parents. And even Marilyn Monroe, when you said they were looking for power men, it was all about the father. You don't get a better father figure than the president of the United States. So it's interesting. I don't think you planned it that way, gentlemen, but you've got a lot of father images coming up.
We were just looking for established charts of well-known people that were AA Rodden ratings, lowest Rodden ratings.
Right, but they had the
That's what
father,
mine
and they
put.
also had famous people before them, except for Marilyn.
Yeah.
Hey, I wanted to chime in. Also, Spencer mentioned that there's an aspect significance about the 29 degrees and cusp. That I would say also that what's very significant to me is that her Jupiter and that center of that yod is on the angles, on the ascendant and descendant. So it has lots to do with personal power opposing Pluto.
Yes.
And her partnerships. And I also wanted to just chime in with the yod is the 10th Hebrew letter with significant Kabbalistic and mystical significance regarding the name of God, omnipresence, or humility. The yod, also known as a finger of God or a finger of fate, has significance as a yod bearer. It indicates there are burdens that needed to be carried through in life.
And
Very good. Yes.
And
I think that's something that we sometimes overlook is to you don't think about what does the word mean itself, or what is the mythology or the story behind it, and sometimes that can add a lot of insight into an aspect or aspect pattern. So thank you.
Could I say something also about the aspect pattern? It almost looks like a mini the lesser triangle, the lesser talent triangle.
The small learning triangle.
Yes, that one, because there's tiny little place where the arrow could be shot through Pluto, and she has reinvented herself multiple times. I mean, she's the queen of reinvention of self.
Yes, she has.
And I think that's her great strength is she just she goes down and she comes right back up something else.
Yes, and when she does, she's right on target.
Yes, exactly.
Right. She has that incredible crucible of Plutonian power.
Yeah.
Well into her 80s, she's activist and speaking and engaged and acting, and career and physical fitness and all of it.
Right. Of topics that are of interest to everyone.
Yeah.
Or current topics, we should say.
Okay, so we're getting short on time here, so let's see what's next. Oh, okay, here we go. Bob Dylan. So here's a classic example of somebody. Look, mono aspect patterns. There's all the 10 planets, and there's an aspect pattern there. Trines, sextiles, squares, but no pattern. So, like I said, this is why I suggest if you can start with the 10 planets and then add in something. Now, the first thing that I would suggest, and that Spencer convinced me of, is to add in the ascendant and the midheaven. So this is what happens when you do that with Bob Dylan.
Mhm.
Look, Ma, a yod. Ascendant to midheaven to moon Saturn. A T-square. Ascendant Mercury and Neptune. So all of a sudden things jump out. Your turn, Spencer.
Well, I was going to point out a couple of things. When you're talking about the yod, this yod has a connection to the ascendant, and the yod was really at the point of the yod is the moon, and then we have the Neptune. And one of the things about Bob Dylan, I think, is very interesting. If you look at this massive stellium of two things, of the earth and the air, and the amount of power that he had as he developed as a singer and as a person who was always seeking change. As I recall, and I will explain this to you, I used to be, my first guitar, I played folk music, and I was, one of these persons that had to read real songs. And yet he came along, wrote songs that were like Blowing in the Wind and things like that, the one about the masters of war, pawn in their game. And then he suddenly decided to go electric, and that changed there. And I was one of the people that was really upset with him for going electric, but he did it, and he made a much bigger play. He became much more famous universally because he made that change. And so he had this very strong connection. If you notice, the Mercury is right up there ruling, the Mercury and the Venus are right there. The Venus, I think, is closer to the aspect, but they're also throwing in the Mercury. So I really think that this guy is a really incredible talent. He came from Hibbing, Minnesota, and he came from there and went to New York and lived in his car and lived on people's couches. And of course, Joan Baez helped him out quite a bit by giving him a lot of time with her, because she was the big folk singer of the time. And so the whole drive, now let's look at the whole drive of the T-square. The whole drive of the T-square is to the Neptune of his own fantasies and dreams and energies, which is a Virgo situation here. And he has all of these trines coming up to him from an earth to earth situation. So he had also the one to make it something that was going to really happen. So you have all the energy to the midheaven, but also all that energy going to the Neptune in the Virgo, which is ruled by the Mercury which is in trine to the midheaven. So that's when Jim and I were looking at that, I was very surprised that we didn't see a lot of his fame when we first threw that thing up there. And then I said, well, I know this guy sold his collection of songs for $200 million, won a Nobel Prize. And as a bundle of energy, I've met him a couple of times, and he's still a very strong individual. And I think that the whole aspect of the chart is truly amazing. And of course, if you look his Jupiter, which rules his Jupiter is on, no, I'm getting in the wrong point here. The Jupiter rules one of the aspects of the ascendant. And so we have this whole concept of the erudite aspects and very jack of all trades and trickster of Gemini, and yet the strong, fixed, I want to make a reputation for myself, I want to make money, I want to be famous, of the Taurus planets moving on and trining the Neptune. So that's about what I have to say about this. And the other thing I want to say is that when we go along here, you're going to find people who until we put other planets in it, the aspect pattern that we see doesn't seem to have it has energy, but it doesn't have focus. And I think when you use the ascendant of the concept of the self and how you present yourself to the world, and the MC, how you function in terms of a a direction that you find, usually when you find attention to yourself as part of your career and part of your other money source. So anyway, that I will stop talking at that, but I think that Bob Dylan had a heck of a T-square and of a yod and of Trine to the midheaven and the Neptune.
I
Thank you,
also
Spencer.
wanted to, I wanted to chime in by saying that it's interesting. I know these are charts of very famous people, but the 10th house or the midheaven really coming into play with quite a few of them. Bob Dylan's yod, the Saturn too, the midheaven. Ricky Martin's had these, what was it? The moon and Mars conjunct in the 10th. There was a mention of AOC or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and she had Sun and Mars conjunct in the 10th. And then Pascio mentioned that the release point of Marilyn Monroe was the Taurus in the 10th house. So all relating to, being in the external world as it released all this tension within these patterns.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, there's a need or a drive to present themselves to the world. Yeah, and whether it's not about becoming famous, it's just about a need to do this, present themselves to the world, and if they become famous, so be it.
At one point, when did he turn to Christianity?
He did that for 3.5 years, and he wrote one hit called "You've Got to Serve Somebody." That was a big hit. He lost a lot of attention at that time because a lot of people didn't understand how he could be one person and then turn into another. And then he didn't stay there very long. He kicked out of that again. He was a nice Jewish boy, and suddenly he turns to Christianity, and that brought a lot of people think that was a woman involved in that he got involved with a very spiritual person. But I was one of the people when he did that, I kind of went south on him, and then I kind of know a lot of him up to that point.
Well, can I say something? I can't see all the planets, but he has a stellium there, but they're in 2 different signs, right?
Right. That's
Yeah,
true.
he's got 4 in Taurus and
Yeah, no, I
2 in
find people,
Gemini.
I have found people that have a stellium in side by side signs that they often have that kind of feeling of being split. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because there's 2 elements at work that have nothing in common, so they have to come out in different ways.
Right.
I don't know that much about Mr. Dylan that I could say what they were, but that's what I've seen.
I think he had that reputation early on. He gave interviews with contradictory and often inaccurate, divergent information as a way to play up his persona.
Right.
And with that quincunx, it's that princess in the pea. It's that itchy thing you can't scratch and can't get to. It's pointing right to his Saturn, right? So it has to do with kind of usurping authority of pulling the rug from out underneath. It's not, it's an itchy aspect.
Yeah. Yeah, and in this case, without the outlet of a boomerang.
Right.
Oh, so, all right. So now here, pop quiz. Okay. So what, if any, chart patterns can you identify in the chart of Aaron Spelling? What about the chart of Miles Davis? So
I just brought up Miles Davis.
Here we go. Here's Aaron Spelling.
Kite.
All right. Yeah, the kite jumps out at you, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
The yod.
The T-square.
Yeah, there you go. T-square. There we go. All right.
He's got 2 yods.
That's right. 2 yods.
Grand Trine is part of the kite.
Yeah, that's Grand Trine. And then
Double
with your Grand Trine with a kite, you've got the small learning triangle on top of the large learning triangle. Yeah.
It almost looks like a mystic rectangle there too.
Who was Aaron Spelling for those of us that are,
It's a big movie producer.
Candy Spelling.
Television, yes, and it was in television a lot.
He had a lot of hits in the late
Tori
60s and 70s.
Tori Spelling's father.
Family.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, he built that huge mansion.
Again, the 10th house. Check out the 10th house. Is this focus of this kite?
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah,
Mhm.
he did Charlie's Angels and what Love Boat and several others that were quite popular during the time. They were,
Maud, you did Maud, the one about moving upside to the west side. What was that
oh,
one?
yeah, and it's,
Jeffersons.
All in the Family.
The Jeffersons, yeah.
Yeah.
yes,
Also TV producer, Public Sphere.
yeah. So we have the Grand Trine, we have a Kite, 2 yodes, which creates a double yode key, which we haven't talked about mainly because it's like, it's something obscure. And I mean, there are a lot of other aspect patterns we could talk about, but then again, we don't have all day.
Yeah.
Right.
And as you mentioned, the T-square of the small talent triangle. Okay, so how about Miles Davis?
Ooh.
Now, I will add that Miles Davis was born in Alton, Illinois, the most haunted small town in America, which has nothing to do with anything. So,
Is a fixed square.
Grand Cross, right? Fixed.
got the fixed Grand Cross,
Grand Trine.
Water
Water.
Trine.
water train. Got all those T-squares.
Yeah.
And something we haven't really talked about yet is the Huber learning triangle, which is the square in conjunct trine aspect. So you see, you have Neptune squaring Saturn, Saturn in quincunx Venus, and Venus trine Neptune. Huber's referred to
Okay.
that as like a learning triangle.
According to the Ubers.
Yeah. And it manifests in 2 different ways. But yeah, we have the Grand Cross, 4 T-squares, Grand Trine, the Huber dominant triangle, which is that learning triangle. Also called a learning triangle or cognition triangle.
And this learning triangle, he got into playing the horn very early and he became very good, and he got into Juilliard, and he heard one of these guys trying to explain jazz from an academic point of view, and he'd been out playing jazz and
Yeah.
was very good at young, and he left Juilliard to continue on his own learning process about being a musician and having his own group and growing with his own type of jazz. So the learning triangle, to me, is something that is very, very interesting and it deserves a lot of attention when you get around to it.
Yeah, I think that also comes from that Grand Cross, just that challenge and conflict is necessary for creative growth.
Oh yeah, it really is
It's
true.
like the quintessential experience of crucifixion.
Very
Yes.
strong. He's a very strong guy.
So going
And-
back to Bob Dylan's chart, I've added in the lunar nodes and Chiron, all points that are commonly used. Now there's essentially, this is a chart with 15 points activated. The 10 planets, the ascendant, the midheaven, the 2 nodes, and Chiron. And you can see it's starting to get a bit confusing. Now, in his case, because he's got the 2 stelliums in Taurus and Gemini, it can be a little easier to, I mean, his chart is so left side, west side focused, Western hemisphere focused, that it makes it a little bit easier to distinguish some of the things, but still, it starts to clutter with all the lines. So you want to, I used to, when I was really getting into astrology, I used to start by, I'd throw in everything practically, and some asteroids and stuff. And then I'd have to sit there and try to figure out what the heck was going on until I finally convinced myself that no, you start at the beginning, start with the 10 planets, and then as you then build from there. Because those 10 planets create the basic dynamics. Okay, well, Q&A, thank you all. So our next meetup is on December 12th, Zooming. We're going to bring back the talk around, start things off. And that'll give everybody a chance to kind of get to know each other a little bit better. Then we take a look ahead at 2022 and the USA's 3 Pluto regions. So get out your crystal balls, your tarot decks, your your transit charts, whatever you use, and start looking at what you think might be coming up next year. February 13th is about a week or so before the US first Pluto return, so we'll talk about that there. And we are now at 994 members strong and growing. So thank you, everybody, for your continued support. There's Spencer's email, my email, and there's a couple more slides that I threw in here. Here's the references. So there's a web link for Huber Astrology. There's the book, Aspect Pattern Astrology by Bernard Bruno and Louise Huber and their son, Michael. There's Aspects of Personality by Karen Hamaker-Zondag. There's a link for a Huber-based Facebook page. There's a link to Cafe Astrology, also Astrology Weekly, and don't forget astro.com. You can get a lot of information there. And while we've given you a lot of stuff, I encourage people to go out there and, you know, surf the internet, look for, you know, T-square. If you've got an aspect pattern that you're trying to figure out, go to different sources on the internet and see what they have to say about it. Find those that start to make sense to you. And that's how you start to really build and become more confident in I think, your ability to function as interpreting chart.
Jim, you have this thing on YouTube. What is the, what do we put down to get?
Okay,
you
so
can see the
yeah.
stuff you put on YouTube.
I'll send out the link for this when it gets up, but I'll send out a link to the YouTube channel where all the stuff that we've done is at.
Okay.
So here's the data for all the charts that we've used. With the exception of Walt Disney's chart, they are all rod and rated AA, which means they had somebody saw their birth certificate. Disney's the only one that's not a AA chart. So you know that this data, this information, date, time, place of birth is about as good as you can get. So here's stuff about the Huber Learning Triangle. I'm not going to go through it because we're running, it's after 2 o'clock. And there's a couple of charts.
Jim, quick question.
Yeah.
I know that a conjunct is not technically an aspect, especially in creating a pattern.
Mm-hmm.
Why, and not only in the Huber method, but why aren't we discussing conjunctions?
Because we're not talking about aspect, we're talking about aspect patterns, which require 3 or more points.
Got it.
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
And I was doing this, I was thinking, you know what, we probably should next year talk about aspect and go back kind of to the basics and talk about the conjunction, the square, the sextile, the oppositions, the trines, and stuff like that as well. So here's Bridget Fonda's chart. This is called the Hubers call this a cognition triangle, and you show the direction of read. You always start at the red and blue corner, the corner of the trine and the square, and you follow the red line to the green line and then to the blue line. Now, this is going counterclockwise, which is the better approach. Basic concept is red reflects the problem, green reflects the adapting to the problem, blue reflects then the time to assimilate it into our character, being, habits, whatever. Now here we see Walt Disney, and his goes the opposite direction. His goes clockwise, again starting at the red and blue, which is happens to be his ascendant. It goes up to Neptune, down to Venus, but going in this direction. The process then becomes one of requires more experience, more experiential, where there may be more trial and error involved. Another way of looking at it is if you read it the direction of the planets, it would be a matter of saying, well, here's the problem, the red line. The blue line is kind of like, well, I'll get to it, procrastination. Green line then is, I've got to do it. You fix it, but then you're confronted with the next problem. So it goes. And with that, thank you, everybody. I'm going to stop screen sharing. I'm going to say thank you to everybody. And I'm going to end this and wish you all adieu. And we'll, if not before, see you in December, because I'm running late for an appointment.
Right.
So,
Thanks.
all right, everybody, take care.
Thanks,
See you soon.
everybody.
Okay.
Bye.
Talk to you
See you
later.
next time.
Bye for
Okay.
now.
Bye.